At dawn, when the mist still hugged the grass like a secret, the Ottoman camp looked peaceful from a distance. Rows of tents, smoke rising in soft columns, horses shifting their weight in silence. Then the banners moved. Not the provincial standards, not the colors of frontier raiders or the proud flags of Timar-holding Sipahis. These were different, closer to the heart, closer to the throne, closer to the man whose shadow decided whether you lived as a lord or died as a lesson. A red banner went first. Behind it rode men who did not look like ordinary cavalry. Their horses were better fed, their posture was colder, their eyes carried the stillness of people who had learned something most soldiers never learn. War is not chaos, it's administration. They were the Sultan's mounted household troops, Kapikulu cavalry, known as the people of the 6 regiments, Altı Bölük Halkı, Sipah, Siladar, right Ulûfe, left Ulûfe, right Gureba, left Gureba. And if you want to understand how the Ottoman Empire could march across continents for centuries, how it could conquer, govern, punish, and return to Istanbul with terrifying efficiency, you must look not only at the Janissaries, you must look at the men behind the Sultan's tent. Because the Kapikulu cavalry weren't simply warriors, they were the court's blade on horseback, and sometimes its tax ledger, its messenger, its police baton, its execution order. And their story begins the way so many Ottoman success stories begin, with a door that closes behind a child. The boy who became property. You don't join the Kapikulu, not at first. First, you are taken. The Ottoman state had multiple pipelines into its elite household system. In the earliest period, captives taken in war, pençik, fed the Sultan's service. Later, the more systematic and famous method expanded, devshirme, the levy that pulled boys, especially from the Balkans, into a state-run transformation so complete it resembled rebirth. The idea was brutal in its clarity. 1. Remove the boy from his old world. 2. Erase his old loyalties. 3. Rebuild him as Kul, the Sultan's servant slave in the political sense, a man whose career, wealth, and survival depended on the palace alone. That word, Kul, is the first shock, because the elite of the empire's center were, in principle, the Sultan's property. Not in the cheap way modern people imagine slavery. This was an imperial system that turned controlled dependence into power. A Kul could become a commander, a governor, a grand official, but he never stopped belonging to the center. So imagine the boy. Imagine the moment the village sounds fade behind him. Imagine the language around him changing. Imagine being told that your future depends on how quickly you learn to stand still, speak correctly, obey instantly. And then comes the second door, the palace. Enderun, the palace that trained wolves in silk. Some boys were chosen for the palace service directly, each Olani. They did not start as cavalry. They started as something more dangerous, raw material for the state. They were trained hard, 2 to 7 years, and then judged again in a second selection called Çıkma, going out. The palace school, Enderun, wasn't only about combat. It taught reading, writing, Islamic studies, physical conditioning, and for the talented, calligraphy, literature, code-like scripts used in finance, accounting. Here is the twist that many viewers don't expect. The Kapikulu cavalry weren't simply warriors. They were educated palace men who could later serve as administrators, clerks, and officials. So while a frontier rider learned to raid, the Enderun boy learned to calculate. And in an empire, calculation kills more reliably than bravery. They lived among others like him, calling each other Laladash, brothers under the same tutor. and they did not marry while they remained inside the palace world. The palace did something subtle and terrifying. It gave you comfort and then made you grateful for it. It gave you status and then reminded you it could remove it. It gave you purpose and then ensured you had nowhere else to place your loyalty. And then, when the palace decided you were ready, it opened the door. Not to freedom, to Birun. Going out, Birun, the world of armed service. When an Enderun boy went out, Chikma, he could be placed into the military classes outside the inner palace, Ocak, including, crucially, the household cavalry. In Istanbul's social world, this mattered. The Kapikulu corps were not anonymous peasants with spears. They were professional, salaried members of the imperial machine. For the household cavalry specifically, the Birun included two core streams, Sipai Olani and Siladar. But the cavalry itself, what people feared and admired, was organized as the 6 regiments. And this is where the story gets sharper, because those 6 regiments weren't equal. They were ranked like layers of a blade.
The 6 banners, a hierarchy you could bleed upward. The Kapıkulu cavalry were divided into Sipa, Siladar, right Ulûfe, sağ Ulûfe, left Ulûfe, sol Ulûfe, right Gureba, sağ garipler, and left Gureba, sol garipler. The first 2, Sipa and Siladar, were known as the upper regiments, Yukarı Bölükler. The next 2 were middle. The last 2 were lower. The bottom 4 together were called Bölükati Erba. Even their banners told you who mattered. Sipa, the red banner, Siladar, the yellow banner, once the head regiment earlier, right Ulûfe, green banner, others variegated banners. And their place in formations was ceremonial and tactical. The Ulûfes stood more open than Sipa and Siladar. The Gureba stood more open still. Now comes the recruitment detail, quiet, administrative, and shocking in its coldness. These cavalrymen could be drawn from janissaries who had earned reward, proved themselves. Boys from palace complexes, Edirne, Galata, and Ibrahim Pasha's palace, and Enderun İç Olani sent out via Chikma. Those Chikma transfers happened at major moments, like a sultan's accession, julus, or at intervals, described as every 7 years in some arrangements, with special labels for different waves. So you had an elite cavalry that was partly battlefield merit, partly palace sorting, and partly a system designed to refresh loyalty to the throne. And loyalty in this machine wasn't sentimental. It was paid. Ulûfe, the sound of coin, the silence of obedience. Unlike Timar holding provincial sipahis, the Kapıkulu were salaried troops. Their wages, Ulûfe, were a pillar of their identity. They were paid in regular cycles, and pay distribution was not just economics, it was politics. A ritual that confirmed the state still worked, the sultan still ruled, and the servants still belonged. The TDV account is blunt. Their Ulûfe was higher than that of the Janissary infantry, and for men stationed outside Istanbul, officers carried their 3-month wages to them. This is one reason they were feared. A man who is paid regularly fights differently from a man who fights for loot. He fights like he expects to live past today. He fights like he has something to lose: rank, pension, privilege, a place near the center. And the empire reinforced that mindset with spectacle and training. Horse culture sharpened into military readiness. Training, horses, Jereed, and the art of controlled violence. If you want a cinematic image of Ottoman cavalry training, don't imagine only sword drills. Imagine a field where riders launch blunt javelins at each other at full speed, testing nerve, aim, reflex, formation discipline. That game is Jereed. It was widely treated as a war training method for mounted troops and became part of Ottoman palace culture, especially from the early 16th century onward, impressing foreign observers as both sport and military exercise. It was also dangerous enough that Sultan Mahmud II banned it in 1826, an echo of how the state could love a tradition and still cut it down when it threatened control. Now layer that onto the Kapıkulu cavalry's daily life. Some lived near Istanbul. Sipah and Siladar had no winter barracks inside Istanbul, tending to reside in nearby areas. Other regiments were spread across Anatolia and Rumelia. And unlike some other core palace bodies, the Kapıkulu cavalry were allowed to marry, and their sons, velides, could be admitted into the regiments. Here comes a quieter shock. These men weren't always in the saddle. They could serve as clerks in the treasury, as aides, as messengers, as managers of imperial endowments, even involved in tax farming roles. So the same rider who guarded the Sultan's tent in war could be the state's hand in your pocket in peace. The cavalry were not merely a weapon. They were a moving extension of government. And government, when threatened, becomes ruthless. What they guarded: the tent, the treasury, the standard. On campaign, each layer of the 6 regiments had core duties. The upper regiments guarding the Sultan's otag, imperial tent, the middle regiments guarding the treasury, the lower regiments often guarding standards and acting as banner protection. Think about what that means in battlefield terms. This cavalry didn't begin as raiders. It began as the final ring around the empire's brain. If the Sultan lived, the state could survive defeat. If the treasury survived, the army could be rebuilt. If the standards survived, morale could be repaired. So the Kapıkulu cavalry did not fight like men desperate to prove themselves. They fought like men whose job was to ensure the war remained an Ottoman war, no matter what happened at the front. And now we reach the part of the story every viewer wants. How did they win? Not in legends, in the ugly mechanics of real battle.
How they fought. The moment the reserve moves. Ottoman warfare in the classical period often combined stable infantry firepower at the center with mobile cavalry action on the flanks and in reserve. The household cavalry sat closer to the command structure, the place where decisions become motion. Their tactics were not always a glorious single charge. Sometimes the most terrifying cavalry action is the one that happens after the enemy thinks the fight is decided. The Kapikulu cavalry excelled at 3 silent battlefield jobs. 1. Protection of command, keeping the command center intact so orders continue. 2. Counterattack timing, striking when the enemy line stretches or breaks. 3. Pursuit and collapse, turning a retreat into a rout. And when they did hit, they hit with a combined tool set typical of Ottoman cavalry: lance, sword, javelins, shields, and armor that varied by region and era, plus the bow culture that made mounted harassment a constant threat. Now, hold the image. A battlefield, dust, drums, a line of infantry holding. The enemy pushes forward, and behind the Sultan's position, the red banner shifts. Not charging yet, just moving, like a verdict being prepared. Mohács, when a kingdom fell in an afternoon. There are many Ottoman victories, but one date became a symbol in Europe. August 29, 1526, the Battle of Mohács. Britannica describes it as a decisive defeat of Hungary by Sultan Suleiman's forces, effectively destroying the Hungarian monarchy's independence and paving the way for Habsburg Ottoman domination in the region. Now, if you're telling this to an audience, you don't describe Mohács as like a textbook. You describe it like the moment a door slammed shut on a civilization. Because for the men of the 6 regiments, battles weren't merely fights. They were state events. They were audits. A kingdom enters the ledger. A kingdom is crossed out. And the cavalry, close to the Sultan, close to the Treasury, learned how to recognize that moment when an enemy stops being an army and starts being prey. This is where the shock factor lives, not in gore, in efficiency, in the cold understanding that once an enemy breaks, you don't fight soldiers anymore, you hunt consequences. The cruel methods, discipline, terror, and the price of being chosen. If you ask what harsh methods the Kapikulu cavalry used, you have to separate 2 kinds of cruelty. 1. Cruelty done to them. Their system was built on controlled dependence. Boys were removed from origins, trained, reshaped, and placed into a hierarchy where the state decided your identity, your rank, your future. They were rewarded, promoted, paid, and never fully free of the palace's hand. 2. Cruelty done by them. As the Sultan's close troops, they had a role in enforcing fear, guarding, escorting, suppressing, protecting the treasury, and, as the TDV account notes, being involved in administrative and financial roles, where a soldier can become an instrument of coercion without drawing a sword. And in war, they fought inside a system that used terror as a language. A captured standard wasn't a trophy, it was a message. A shattered cavalry wing wasn't just defeat, it was panic spreading through an army like fire through dry grass. A perfectly timed countercharge wasn't courage, it was calculation. Here is the uncomfortable truth your audience will feel. The Kapikulu cavalry's shock factor was that they were professional. Professional violence is always more frightening than emotional violence because it doesn't get tired, it doesn't hesitate, it doesn't argue with itself.
The decline, when privilege rots into rebellion. Even the sharpest blade dulls if you use it wrong. The TDD account describes how deterioration began around the end of the 16th century, with people admitted from outside contrary to regulations, and how the cavalry regiments became involved repeatedly in rebellion movements. At one point, Kapıkulu cavalrymen could keep additional paid followers, 1 man for every 5 akçe, but that practice was abolished under Kopru Mehmed Pasha after it provoked unrest. And then comes the final act of the Ottoman central military story. After the Janissary Corps was abolished, the household cavalry regiments were also removed. The door that had created them closed. The last ride of the Red Banner. If you were a Kapıkulu cavalryman at the height of the empire, your life could look like a dream from the outside. Paid regularly, honored in processions, near the Sultan, trained in palace culture, carrying a banner whose color made crowds fall silent. But the dream had its hidden clause. You were not a free man. You were a tool the state sharpened, and tools don't get to decide when they're put away. That's the real intrigue. That's the real shock. Not simply that they were deadly, but that they were designed. A system that could take a boy from a village, remake him in a palace, mount him on a horse, place him behind the Sultan's tent, pay him like a professional, and then, if politics demanded it, erase his regiment from history. So the next time you imagine the Ottoman battlefield, don't look only at the front line. Look at the place near the command center, where the Red Banner waits, where the cavalry holds still, where the empire decides, quietly, who gets to exist when the dust settles. because the most terrifying cavalry charge is the one that begins after you realize the war was never really about you. It was about the state, and the state had a horse.